Hi, it's me again, Kim. I'm going to be reading from The Last Indian War again. Sorry, I have a hard time turning it the right way. I don't know why. Okay, I'm moving it away. And I'm starting on page 206. So here we go. His confidence was quickly dashed. The Snake River Plain was a wide east-west corridor that was easily traversed but undulated with disorienting lava ridges. The trail was easy to follow. Besides the path of hooves and travois poles, 50 yards wide, the Nez Perces had piled large cones of horse dung at each resting spot, signs of contempt for the inept pursuit. Howard camped on August 19th, where the Nez Perces had been the night before, a rich pasture called Camas Meadows. He had gained no ground that day. We could see their dust miles and miles away, an officer wrote, but his fighting strength had grown by yet another group of volunteers, and, more promising, a company of 60 cavalrymen under Captain Randolph Norwood. As Howard's horses fed on the lush grasses and his soldiers pulled trout from Camas Creek, the Nez Perces were making their own move. It started with a vision that came to a warrior wounded at the Big Hole. According to one account, it was Black Hair. According to another, it was Grizzly Bear Youth, whose Wayakin was the air bird, a gigantic creature that alighted only on clouds, never in trees or on the earth. In both accounts, the vision's message was the same. Cut Arm Howard was camped at Camas Meadows, and warriors would double back over their route and return with many of the army's animals. When their leader learned that Howard was indeed camped at the meadows, they took the vision as a sign and a chance to add again to their herd and to slow their enemy's pursuit. A large party set off at sunset on August 19th to fulfill the prophecy. Just before dawn, they drew near Howard's camp. He had posted a heavy guard. Wood felt safe enough on retiring to take off his pants for the first time in many days. But some warriors were able to creep among some grazing animals. At this point, a man toward the rear prematurely fired his rifle, either out of nervousness or petulance. Always Otskay was doing something like that, Wotolan said later, crazy actions. With that, I don't know what these words are. A reveille of, it's Reveille, reveille of musketry brought troops and civilians out of their blankets. For the only time in the war, the army received a surprise attack, and the result was chaos. Men scrambled for clothes and weapons, often finding neither, and the night was filled with the screams of horses and mules, the falsetto yells of the attackers, the buzz of bullets, and rifle flashes that seemed a magnified imitation of a swarm of fireflies flitting in the alders. The volunteers were especially terrified. Some ran and fell into the creek. Their commander tried to pull a hat onto his foot as a boot. In the end, there was only one grazing wound, probably a ricochet, perhaps because most troops had kept down, while the civilians, camped in the lower drainage of the creeks, were well below the line of fire. Almost as suddenly as it had begun, the attack was finished. The mounted Nez Perces had charged close and fired blindly into the camp, while those afoot had stampeded the herd back toward the trail. There had been talk of infiltrating to kill Howard and his staff, but once the attack was sprung, the warriors contented themselves with the theft of the horses, or what they thought were horses. As they tried to hurry the animals to their camp, they were puzzled by their slow gait. Daylight explained it. Mules. Howard had ordered the cavalry mounts picketed along a strong cable anchored with iron rods. The bell mares had been hobbled. Only the pack mules were set out to graze, and only these, along with some of the volunteers' horses, were taken. Some horse cultures, like the Comanches, had a high affection for mules. but not the Nez Perces. Their feelings were summed up later by Yellow Wolf. Or eh. Just as they discovered their error, they realized they were being chased. Mules were essential to Howard's heavily laden column, and he immediately sent 3 companies of cavalry under Major George Sanford to retrieve the pack animals, numbering roughly 150. Meanwhile, Howard prepared his infantry for another possible attack. He apparently assumed the Nez Perces would leave the mules and run once they spotted the pursuit, but instead they sent the mules ahead and, about 8 miles from Camas Meadows, deployed behind some low ridges. When the cavalry came within 1,000 yards, they opened fire. The 3 companies in turn dismounted, sent their horses to the rear with handlers, and found their own cover. In the first exchanges, the young bugler of the company farthest to the right was shot through the heart and killed. Some long-distance dueling followed, and after about an hour, some Nez Perces were able to dodge through the broken terrain and begin to fire at close range on the left end of Sanford's line. Afraid he might be outflanked, Sanford ordered everyone to fall back, but as the withdrawal began, the warriors began to turn both the left and right flanks, and with that, the companies at each end retreated so quickly that the one in the middle, commanded by the newly arrived Norwood, found itself suddenly alone. He led his company in a dash to a stand of aspens on a lava knoll, where they frantically stacked pieces of loose lava into more than a score of small breastworks. They faced in every direction, assuming a surround. When Howard heard of the fight, he hurried with reinforcements and met the 2 retreating companies and Sanford, who said he had chosen to, quote, draw back a little in face of opposition. Howard asked the obvious, quote, but where is Norwood, unquote, and then, quote, that is what I am trying to find out, Sanford answered, begging the question of how he would locate Norwood by running away from him. Howard turned the companies around, and by the time the combined forces reached Norwood's beleaguered company, the Nez Perces had broken off and returned to their camp several miles farther on. Norwood's cavalry had endured 4 hours of sharpshooting, some from warriors who had moved within 50 yards. 8 of his men were wounded. 2 would die. 3 if the count includes a corporal who later killed himself after chronic pain from 2 cartridges that were driven from his belt into his hip by an enemy bullet. For Lieutenant Henry Benson, his wound was poor payment for a determined effort to do his duty. He had been on leave back east when he read that his unit, Gibbon's 7th Infantry, had been set to the chase. After traveling by train, steamboat, and wagon to Fort Shaw, he had set off on his own to catch up, arrived too late for the fight at the Big Hole, but persuaded Gibbon to assign him to Howard. He joined Howard on August 18th. 2 days later, lying behind some low rocks during the initial encounter, he was shot through the buttocks. The next day, he and the other wounded were sent to Virginia City. Virginia City. Where's Virginia City, I wonder? Remarkably, the Nez Perces who stayed in their camp remained there throughout the day's long combat instead of using the time to put more distance between themselves and Howard. Even stranger, Howard did not press on to attack them. The opportunity would seem too good to pass up. When he reached Norwood's company, he was less than 10 miles away, closer than he had been since the fight on the Clearwater, and closer than he would be until the end of the campaign. He had about 200 cavalry and infantry and a howitzer. Except for Norwood's company, the command was nowhere near exhausted, and there were hours of daylight left. The Bannocks urged him to fight, yet Howard took his men back to Camas Meadows, buried the young bugler, and gave orders to fortify the camp in case the Nez Perces, who had ridden 36 miles and fought a battle during the past 24 hours, rode another 18 miles and attacked him. Howard appeared shaken and cowed, a mood likely felt by the whole command. I candidly think Joseph would whip our cavalry, a journalist wrote from the camp, and cannot blame General Howard for not giving him battle. That evening, Howard's infantry caught up with him. He had last seen them way back at the hot springs on Lolo Pass when he had taken off to help Gibbon in his pursuit. With a considerable train of civilian wagons, they had labored their way up the Bitterroot Valley and over the divide to Big Hole, and then pushed methodically on in the cavalry's wake. They were still behind by 2 or 3 days' normal marching when a courier brought news of the raid at Camas Meadows. Immediately they surged ahead, the infantry alternately riding in wagons and marching at quick time, and at sundown they arrived at the meadows. They had covered a remarkable 46 miles in a day. For the first time since leaving Idaho, Howard's command was united, and the next day, August 21st, they traveled 18 miles and camped about where the Nez Perces had been the previous day. They followed the trail another 2 days through, quote, the most tangling mass of lava that one could imagine, unquote, before learning that the bands had passed Henry Lake and entered the mountains through Targhee, then called Tacker. Why is it Targhee and then called Tacker Pass? The quarry was loose and off into the high country. What a disappointment, Howard later wrote.